news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog, and yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for the briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, the briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:31 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, here on GB News on a momentous morning, a morning of a new cabinet, a new government, and indeed leading up to a new Prime Minister's questions. We'll be exploring exactly what is this new government. Has it lurched to the left? Has it lurched to the right? Is it returning to the 2019 manifesto, or is that manifesto no longer relevant? We'll be exploring what kind of government will Rishi Sunak be running after the headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:32. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister is chairing his first cabinet meeting with his newly appointed team this morning. Yesterday, 6 ministers were given the same role, including Suella Braverman, who is again Home Secretary. Downing Street says the new team reflects a unified party. Later, it's expected he'll hold talks with the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, on their economic plans and decide when the fiscal plan, due to be delivered on Monday, will take place. Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson claims there are no plans for growth.
We're in a terrible situation now as a country, facing, that black hole that they've created, and we still don't actually fully know the scale of the damage because they've refused to publish the report from the Office of Budget Responsibility that would give us that information. But there is no plan for growth. We've had terrible growth under the Conservatives for the last 12 years, and in fact under Rishi Sunak, who was Chancellor for a significant period of that.
Well, at midday, Rishi Sunak will make his first appearance in the Commons as Prime Minister. He'll face opposition leader Sir Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's questions. Labour has criticised Mr Sunak's decision to reappoint the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, a role she left last week over a breach of the ministerial code. Well, you can watch PMQs live here on GB News, of course, at midday. Well, the new Prime Minister has held talks with the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales. In discussion with Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford, Rishi Sunak is said to have emphasised the UK's shared challenges, with Scotland's First Minister saying the talks have been constructive. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and US President Joe Biden were among the first world leaders to speak with Mr Sunak last night. And in other news, the Princess of Wales is to be the patron of a new mission for an army officer to be the first woman to cross Antarctica solo. Catherine is formally backing Captain Preet Chandy's challenge of travelling more than 1,000 miles across the frozen continent. The army officer has spoken with the Princess on the phone, who wished her good luck. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Tom.
Morning to you, it's 9:34 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and indeed on your radio. Now we've got a big show coming up for you today, exploring particularly what Rishi Sunak's cabinet is like. But let's remind ourselves first of all of what Rishi Sunak said on the steps of Downing Street last night.
I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, Liz Truss. She was not wrong to want to improve growth in this country. It is a noble aim. And I admired her restlessness to create change. But some mistakes were made.
Well, there was Rishi Sunak speaking on the steps of Downing Street, of course, yesterday afternoon. But who are the top people in his team? Well, let's look at some of those great offices of state, which actually have remained relatively similar. Jeremy Hunt is there, who is, of course, remaining as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, next, of course, we also have another person remaining at the top, and that's the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. He stays in post too. And making a rapid, if controversial, return to the Home Office after 6 days away from the job is Suella Braverman too. But relative stability in those top 3 posts may somewhat mask a fairly brutal culling lower down the pecking order. Well, this is what the Cabinet looked like this time yesterday morning. You can see those smiling faces all sitting in Liz Truss's final Cabinet photograph. But this is how many have now gone, assuming that the Cabinet appointments were completed last night. Yes, 18 faces no longer around that Cabinet table. 18 faces gone. Now, Nicholas Allen, Professor of Politics at Royal Holloway University of London, says that that was comfortably the most brutal reshuffle since 1945, and probably since 1868, when his data begins. Now, looking at those 18 faces that are no longer around the Cabinet table, 15 supported Liz Truss over the summer in that leadership contest. 3 were undeclared, and just 1 was a spacker of Rishi Sunak. So a pretty seismic clear-out of a lot of people who were supportive of Liz Truss. Well, Rishi Sunak will face his first public challenge today when he goes head-to-head with the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, at Prime Minister's Questions. So let's cross over now to Downing Street, where our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, is waiting for us. And Darren, you've been there in the morning as those cabinet ministers have been walking in. What do you expect the mood is like in Rishi Sunak's first cabinet meeting, being hosted, of course, as we speak?
Well, in some ways, I think there will be a relatively jubilant mood. For those that have come back to the Cabinet again, they'll be pretty happy. People like Dominic Raab, Michael Gove. I think there will be relief among those that have managed to hold on onto their jobs, like Chris Heaton-Harris in Northern Ireland, or indeed James Cleverly as Foreign Secretary, and many others. But also, I think there will be a sense of just the difficult decisions facing this Cabinet. We know that, as Jeremy Hunt put it, there'd have to be some eye-wateringly difficult decisions to be made in the days, weeks and months to come around things like departmental spending. Almost certainly cuts going to come to many government departments. In addition to that, potentially the possibility of tax rises too. And that is aside from the day-to-day stuff of how do you stop these kind of anti-oil protesters. That's a big task for the Home Secretary alongside dealing with the English boat crisis. Steve Barclay, Health Secretary again, is going to have to deal with another crisis in the NHS, it seems, this winter. Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, again, having to deal with the war in Ukraine and the, frankly, quite dangerous noises emanating from the Kremlin. So almost in every government department, there is a really, really serious challenge, effectively, for each Cabinet Minister, and I think that is why there will be a real sense, and indeed Tom Tugendhat, the Security Minister, who's also back in his job, just going into Downing Street, he is a little late. I thought Cabinet was due
10 minutes late there for the Cabinet meeting.
Up to this morning. I know. That's pretty bad, isn't it? Particularly when it's essentially the first day back in school. So, so what I'm trying to say is I think, there will be a real sense of seriousness, I think, around the Cabinet table this morning. Just to pick up on your point about the kind of big change of the Cabinet. I think in many regards, given the fact that Rishi Sunak stood outside number 10 and talked about the big mistakes that have been made in the last administration, in many regards, it's a surprise maybe he didn't get rid of more ministers. Now, I think that's a sign of clearly his political weakness and the divisions within the party. But there is a possibility that some of these government ministers will be associated with the past failings, even in this new administration. That will be a bit of a dangerous thread potentially for the new Prime Minister. Clearly, the big moment today is PMQs at 12, isn't it, Tom? I suspect Labour will go reasonably hard on Suella Braverman. Her appointment is an appointment of integrity and professionalism and to the highest standards, given the fact that she resigned last week with suggestions she'd broken the ministerial code and even having made the admission that she made a mistake herself. And also, here is the Home Secretary, I think, leaving her home this morning. She is currently inside. She was actually one of the first ministers to arrive this morning, at least on time. And there will be a little bit of disquiet, and there is a bit of disquiet about Penny Morden's position, having remained simply as Leader of the House rather than potentially a promotion. And there is this also continuing discussion, and I think this will dominate later on today, about when precisely this medium-term fiscal plan is going to come. It looks like it is going to be delayed beyond Monday. It was meant to be, of course, next Monday. There's a sense the markets have stabilised, that they need a bit more breathing time to get this right, not to muck it up like last time. And I think that date may be pushed back. And, of course, the reshuffle, if you want to call it that, has not ended. There are lots of ministerial positions still to be filled and people to be moved around, and that will continue later on today. Yes,
expecting those more junior ministerial posts coming throughout today, potentially a little bit later as well for the PUSSs and all the rest of it as you go lower and lower down the ministerial rung. But Darren, don't go anywhere. We'll be cutting across to you as soon as we start seeing those big cabinet beasts leaving that door and hopefully see what you're going to shout at them too, as is, of course, time-honoured tradition on Downing Street. Darren McCaffrey, thank you for joining us on the briefing this morning. Well, listening to all of that in the studio is Ben Glaze, the Deputy Political Editor at the Daily Mirror. And Ben, it's interesting, looking at a lot of the analysis this morning, people are saying this is a unity cabinet, that Rishi Sunak is trying to bring people across from different parts of the party. But ultimately, 18 of those faces that were in cabinet yesterday morning are now gone.
I think that speaks to quite how much Liz Truss, as Prime Minister, surrounded herself with supporters. If Rishi Sunak wanted to stamp his authority on his cabinet as much as he possibly could, he was obviously going to have to get rid of some people to bring in new people. And because Liz Truss had gone out of her way to exclude supporters of Rishi Sunak when she formed her cabinet at the start of September, necessarily she surrounded herself with her own supporters. So when Rishi Sunak wanted to put some new ministers in, he was always going to have to get rid of those who support, or some of those who supported Truss. So what we saw yesterday when the new Prime Minister was appointing his top team was he has tried to draw on previous supporters of Truss, previous supporters of Boris Johnson, and indeed people who supported him during the leadership campaign, the first leadership campaign over the summer. So we've seen some new faces, but we've also seen quite a lot of old faces brought back. I mean, there's a few ministers who hark back to the David Cameron era. You look at Mark Harper, he was David Cameron's chief whip. He's been brought back into government now as the Secretary of State for Transport. So I think Rishi Sunak really did yesterday try to unify the parliamentary party. And one reason for that, it's not just to sort of show the public, look, we're trying to come back together. It's also to try and prevent any rebellion and revolt against his very early premiership. You want to nip those things in the bud.
It's interesting looking at the people who are perhaps best with numbers being back in the cabinet. Gavin Williamson, a huge organiser and another former chief whip. Mark Harper, a former chief whip, as you mentioned. And indeed, Mr Spreadsheet himself, Grant Shapps, now running the business department. I suppose having all of those organisers in the tent is probably a wise thing. But what can all of these appointments tell us about the ideological direction of this government? There's some appointments that people can say, oh, this is a government of the right. There's others where people would say, well, this is a big tack to the left. What can we take from it all?
I think Rishi Sunak has tried to sort of drag the cabinet back to the centre ground. He hasn't tacked to the left or too much to the right, but he's sort of done away with the hard right, if you like, that Liz Truss had for 7 weeks. So it has sort of brought it back to the centre ground, which is, of course, where most elections are won. He yesterday as well spoke about the 2019 election-winning manifesto, which Boris Johnson, when he tried to make a comeback over the weekend, he sort of tied himself to that and said that basically it was his manifesto. He got the mandate when he won that thumping majority, remember, of 80 Commons seats back in December 2019. But Rishi Sunak wanted to highlight that no one person owned that manifesto. It was a Conservative Party manifesto. Now, by doing that and claiming that as his mandate, and of course there's no constitutional reason or need for a general election, despite the fact that a majority of voters seem to want one. by tying himself to it, he does sort of tie himself to a lot of the pledges in it as well, many of which have already been binned, and some of which, in the aftermath of COVID, of course, may look unaffordable.
And many of which he binned himself as Chancellor, not least the national insurance tax hike, and I suppose the spirit of the corporation tax hike, because the manifesto spoke of the 19% rate as something that was internationally competitive. I do wonder, though, if this government is casting itself as one of the centre ground, as one of the grown-ups, as a lot of people around Rishi Sunak like to describe themselves, how is that a big difference to where the Labour Party is now positioning itself? Are we going to see at midday today, at Prime Minister's Questions, two pretty boring, pretty centrist, pretty technocratic individuals, a mirror image of one another?
Yes, is the short answer to that. I do think that PMQs is going to be dull for a while, and people on the Conservative Party, they'll appreciate that, because you look how far behind they are in the polls. They want a bit of dullness, a bit of sobriety at the top of government. It does make it difficult for Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, because, you know, when he was up against Boris Johnson at noon every Wednesday, he was able to set very clear dividing lines as the sort of sober, boring, if you like, leader of the opposition against the sort of flamboyant, bamboozling Prime Minister. There were two big contrasts there. We never really got a sense of how Keir Starmer and Liz Truss would go up against each other on a regular basis, because necessarily it was a very short premiership for Liz Truss. So I think what we see today, it will be sort of relatively sober, yes, probably quite technocratic. There might be, you know, an exchange of numbers. There'll be a lot of number crunching, I would have thought. And you know, it's quite interesting thinking once Cabinet breaks up in the next sort of few minutes, Rishi Sunak will have his advisors around him prepping him for PMQs before he heads over to Parliament for noon.
Well, we saw Tom Tugendhat, the Security Minister, arrive 10 minutes late for Cabinet. I have to say, I was on Downing Street a few hours ago, and arriving 2.5 hours early were Michael Gove and Oliver Dowden. Now, there's some speculation that these two individuals turned up to help Rishi Sunak with Prime Minister's Questions prep. And I wonder, what would you expect the Leader of the Opposition to really go in on in his 6 questions this afternoon?
That's right. Well, Gavin Williamson and Michael Gove, they used to brief David Cameron for PMQ, so seeing them brought back, yeah, that does make sense that they would be briefing Rishi Sunak. I think Sir Keir Starmer will highlight the lack of growth in the economy, and we'll try and tie that to the former Chancellor, now the Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak, when he spoke yesterday of the problems he's trying to fix, well, it's OK looking at the 49-day premiership of Liz Truss, and yes, he was brought in to fix that. But the lack of growth, you know, if you were in the Treasury for nearly 2.5 years, you have to take responsibility for some of that. And obviously, he'll point to the coronavirus pandemic as one reason for that lack of growth, and that's fair. But then you look at international rivals, and they're not suffering from quite the poor growth rates that we are. So I think Keir Starmer will go on the attack over that. Also, the cost of living crisis, and also, maybe not for Keir Starmer, but some Labour backbenchers. I think they might want to get a bit more down and dirty and personal with Rishi Sunak, highlighting, of course, his wife and her non-dom tax status that she's now given up, and the fact that as a couple they're worth £730 million according to the Sunday Times rich list, and that in an economic crisis for most families in Britain. You know, that contrast, that's out of touch. That will be highlighted, I'm sure.
Yes, it's a lot of money. I was looking earlier with some of my team at just how much money it is in comparison. More money than Tom Cruise, more money than Celine Dion, more money than Bono. It's interesting. I think there was one estimate that it was more than even Kim Kardashian, if someone could imagine such a thing. But Ben Clay's hold that thought. We will return at the end of the programme. But next Monday is still, at this stage at least, and that is thrown hugely into question now, but that could well be the date set by Number 11 for the medium-term fiscal plan, as Rishi Sunak's rise to the Tory leadership seems to have calmed the markets. Now, the Chancellor, as he is still the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, reversed some of those policies, most notably many of the tax cuts that came to define, briefly, Trussonomics. Well, this morning, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, suggested that the new Prime Minister may delay the fiscal plan so that it matched more with Rishi Sunak's priorities. Well, let's dive right in and see what those priorities may well be. I'm joined by James Blagden, Chief Data Analyst at the think tank Onward, and Matthew Lesh, the Head of Public Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you so much to the both of you. First of all, James Blagden, let's start with you. what is the big set of... what is the big idea behind what may well become to be known as Rishinomics?
I think it's worth remembering just how far behind the Conservative Party is in the polls. So the main thing, I think, for Rishi Sunak is to rediscover the election-winning combination of policies that were so successful in 2019. And that means, we've polled on this quite frequently, that means a combination of centre-left economics and centre-right on culture. That means delivering high-quality public services. That means levelling up, as the PM made quite clear in his speech yesterday. And so I think that's what he needs to rediscover and to depart quite sharply from the Trustonomics experiment of the last 7 weeks.
Now, Matt Lesh, I'm going to throw that to you. Do you think that the only way the Conservative Party can be successful here is to lean left on the economic agenda?
Look, I think that's obviously patently absurd. Nobody voted for Boris Johnson for the Conservatives in 2019 because they wanted a left-wing economic agenda. They had Corbynomics and they had the failed ideas of nationalisation, higher taxes and more state spending. I think it's worth acknowledging the 2019 manifesto committed the UK to keeping corporate taxes low and in fact laughed at the idea of Jeremy Corbyn putting up corporate taxes to 27%, and now we're going to be pretty close to that under the Tories. It also had a commitment to freeze income tax, as well as, in principle, national insurance as well. So, I mean, I think in terms of actually addressing what the economic challenge here is, though, now there is an immediate need to stabilise the government's fiscal position. Now, that can't be just achieved through tax increases because that's going to risk slowing down the economy. It is patently madness to send a signal to international investors that as we're potentially heading into a recession, that we should have higher taxes. That means we're going to have to look at doing something on the spending side. But in the longer run, and I think Rishi has acknowledged this as well, the Liz Truss very much highlighted an important issue that the UK has been underperforming in economic growth. So the real debate we need to have now is, and what I'd be interested to see, because I don't think it's particularly well defined, is what is Rishi's plan to boost economic growth? Will he continue with some of the supply side reforms in planning, in infrastructure? Will he get on to reforming public services so that we can spend less and get better outcomes? What is the plan to boost Britain's prosperity? And then I think when you get to electoral outcomes there, if people are feeling better off in a few years' time because of successful economic policies, the electoral outcomes will make sense in themselves.
Yes, very interesting that Rishi Sunak has brought back Robert Jenrick to the Cabinet, of course, the author of some supply-side housing reform policy, although he's now back in the Home Office rather than the Housing Ministry. Let's go back to James Blagden now. What do you make of Matthew Lesh's assertion that there's a rewriting going on of the 2019 manifesto amongst the media, that everyone's reinterpreting it as somehow more left-wing of a document economically than it actually was? It promised lower taxes. It promised a more competitive market economy.
That's a fair point, I think. The main thing we're seeing in our polling right now, and that we've seen over the last few years even, is that when you ask voters on specific policies on, say, corporation tax, rising corporation tax is incredibly popular. Essentially taxing big businesses to pay for the NHS is a policy that has overwhelming support. And you find this across a range of policy when you ask about a trade-off between cutting taxes to let people keep more of their own money versus spending more on public services. And you find that 2019 Conservative voters overwhelmingly would rather have high-quality public services funded through taxation than cutting income taxes, and especially cutting corporation taxes.
And yet we saw that the national insurance increase became a very controversial political football, I suppose. The Labour Party opposing it, the Lib Dems, the SNP, and eventually it being repealed. Just in our last minute, Matthew Lesh, do you think that Trussonomics has damaged the free market cause?
Look, I think the idea of unfunded tax cuts, of a huge energy package, of not taking fiscal responsibility seriously has been damaged. I think that's widely acknowledged as the core mistake of Trussonomics. But the idea of trying to get up the UK's growth, of trying to keep taxes low, now I don't think just saying, oh, the polls like the idea of higher corporate taxes and therefore that's what the Tories should do, really gels particularly well with good policy making, or what will ultimately deliver prosperity or even ultimately good electoral outcomes. We can think about short-term popularity and do what everything says has 51% support in the polls, like Onward sometimes seems to suggest. We can actually do good policy, get good outcomes and win elections in the end.
Well, I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme there, but gentlemen, thank you both, James Bagden and Matthew Lesh, for joining us here on The Briefing. Really interesting discussion there. And thank you too to Ben Glaze, who's been with me throughout. And I'm afraid we have run to the end of the programme, so no final word. We'll have to get you back very, very soon. But that's it from me today. Thank you for sticking with us. But do stay around for the next 2 hours where I'm presenting To the Point, where no doubt we'll see some Cabinet members leaving Downing Street and running up to that all-important Prime Minister's questions too. Do not go anywhere.
Good morning, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest broadcast from the Met Office. Wednesday, sunny spells, scattered showers, blustery winds, but very mild for the time of year. Looking at the pressure pattern, and low pressure still dominates our weather as we move through the next few days, drawing in warm air from the near continent, but tightly packed isobars indicate quite brisk winds at times, particularly over the next 24 hours. So a gusty start to the day. Wednesday morning, sunny spells, scattered showers pushing their way north and eastwards, but it should slowly become a bit drier as we head through the morning. There will be a few scattered showers around, perhaps heavy at times, but most places staying dry. A blustery afternoon though, winds still gusting around 40-45 miles an hour around some western coasts. But a southerly direction with those winds means another warm day, 15, 16, 17 in the north, 18 to 20 Celsius across southern parts. So exceptionally mild for the time of year. Through into the evening, we'll see a few showers around, plenty of clear spells initially. Still very windy across the far northwest of Scotland, outbreaks of rain here. And then overnight, we'll see thicker clouds and patchy rain starting to push northwards. This will stop the temperatures from dropping too low. Again, 12 to 16 Celsius for many. The average should be around 6 or 7. So a warm night to come. Thursday morning, quite a cloudy start, perhaps some sunny spells for Northern Ireland, southern Scotland initially, but patchy cloud and rain will push its way northwards through the day. The wind should ease as the day goes on, perhaps still a little blustery around the coast. And there will be some drier, brighter interludes at times, particularly across the south and the east. And where we see any spells of sunshine, it will lift temperatures into the low 20s, 21 Celsius possible, but mild for everyone, 15 to 17 Celsius, normally 14 or 15 as a high at this time of the year. It stays similar as we move towards the end of the week into the weekend, further blustery rain at times and temperatures staying on the mild side. See you again soon.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or